and then reducing pesticides and increasing biodiversity. So they're some of the goals. So when we talk about having all of that information, trying to zero in on that a little bit is really understanding the site and the influences on the site, the existing conditions, and that's going to be your basis for a successful project. So that includes, like I said, the background research, understanding the client, understanding what their needs are and what their vision is. The natural resource assessment is critical with these projects. We have to have, you can't just guess at what the soil's conditions are. You gotta do the tests. You gotta have it up front so that you can make those decisions as you go through the process. And then developing the base plan and the background on it. So just to give you an idea in relationship to kind of a conventional design process, when you're trying to do something that's sustainable, it's within a context. And you know, I have a real challenge working on a project or a site anymore when just, here's the plan, this is the site, here, design this. You have to understand the context of it, where it is in the watershed. What are the influences on the particular site? What are the historic influences on the site? How has this site changed over time? Those types of things help us to better understand what surprises there might be down the road. So just to give you kind of some background on that, now this is a bigger level, but it'll kind of give you an understanding of some of the things that we tend to look at. Starting with the history of a site and the history of a region, we'll often go back and we will look at historic maps. We'll look at different historic maps over a period of time. And what does this tell us? Well, from a water resource standpoint and from a watershed standpoint, we start to see things when you overlay these old, say, 1864 bridges is one that we go to pretty frequently. It's available in Lancaster County. I think there's one in Blair County too. I think I came across one. I think Blair has a, it's called Bridgens 1864, but it was surveys that were done of townships in Pennsylvania back at that time. They're surprisingly accurate to a degree. I would have thought, you start to lay these historic maps out and our current GIS and you overlay them, and sometimes it takes a little bit till you find that intersection because there weren't as many roads back at that time. But what it tells us is things like, once you overlay it, we start to see these stream systems. And if you were in our talk yesterday when Ben presented the one project in Lidditz that we're doing, and we have the historic map as to where the stream system went historically, and it kind of went down through, say this area. And then today, that stream system actually goes like this, along the property lines. Well, it was dramatically altered. And that's what we're looking for, is what were those big events or big things that happened that changed the landscape. So here's one example. It's kind of hard to see, but you look at this black area on it almost looks like a vein, and then it's like kind of a clogged artery to a degree. And in actuality, I guess you could use that as a reference for it, because it represents a mill dam and the pond behind it. So we will look for those. There's a dam here, and there was a mill pond at one point. There's the mill race goes out around it. So you can look at that and then look at what has happened over time, and it's really interesting what you'll find in some areas where there had been a huge pond, a huge mill pond, now is basically a meadow that somebody's probably pasturing cows in or something. Typically there's legacy sediment, 2 to 3 foot high, very incised stream bank running through it. We've had some photographs of projects that have come back, some historic photos of what looks now like a huge farm field that these photos are of people in rowboats and boats in ponds in that same location. So, you know, it's really interesting and I think very informative to have an understanding of, you know, the base history of sites to kind of know what you're getting yourself into and to kind of give you some background. Then from a regional context, we'll start to, you know, zero down in and looking at land use and looking, you know, a little bit closer into what are the influences for the particular site. And then obviously this is what we're so used to, is really looking at the individual site. We have so much great resource information now with GIS and aerial photography and the detail, even Google, what is it, where you're actually driving through the sites, and we use this all the time. It's just amazing to be able to really kind of understand the context of an actual site. So here's a better picture of what I was talking about with the historic context. This site is actually up close to Bloomsburg, and you know, when you start working with clients, sometimes they're zeroed in on their project, and they're looking right at this project. In this case, this was the actual site. And when we got involved, our first reaction was to, let's step back. What is it that's causing the problems? Because right in through here on Fishing Creek, they had incredibly severe flooding during Tropical Storm Lee, and back, I guess it was 2-3 years ago. So, which wiped out numerous houses and also created flooding that went basically the whole way across this area south of, west of Bloomsburg, down to the Susquehanna River. I don't know if anyone's familiar with what happened in that area, but it was pretty some significant flooding. So we stepped back a little bit and went back and looked at this. This is the historic map. So Fishing Creek went like this, okay? And that, you know, that's pretty close to the way it is today. The existing Fishing Creek, except right here at this point, it's lopped off and it comes up like this, all right? So we'll look at that in the next map. And what we found out was when they put I-81 across, they used the dam crossing right here as their crossing for 81. And they also put the embankment in and basically cut off this entire section of Fishing Creek from the rest of the stream. Now, you know, most people will think, well, what's the big deal? You know, you're losing a little bit of Fishing Creek. Well, what's happened is it's created a huge sediment deposition area back up in this section behind 81, which has a ripple effect and starts to affect the amount of deposition and cobbles that are moving through the system. And if you were in Ben's talk yesterday, he talked about, you know, the influence of that bed load moving through the system, which affects the stream dynamics, which affects this site, okay? So from a regional context standpoint, this is what happens today. So we have I-80, I'm sorry, it's not 81, it's I-80. 80 comes across at this point. This is where the historic mill race had gone, basically on that historic map. And the Fishing Creek comes into this point. Well, each one of these little circles with triangles are what we refer to as pinch points. And whenever you have water coming through an area and it goes into a pinch point, it reverberates through the system. We also have a lot of erosion that starts to occur down through here. So we've got a big pile of cinders that was just basically piled in this location, which creates another pinch point here, which means more deposition at this point. Sharp bend, another pinch point, and so on down through. But looking at that, that's the big picture, but we needed the historic map in order to determine that. So how is all of this regional stuff affecting the individual site? Well, this is the site right at that bend, and what's happened is there's a huge deposition zone that's occurred right here at this bend. This is a bridge, and this is a dam crossing, so they're affecting the system. And as this deposition zone has filled up, it's caused the flows to go right through here, through the actual town of Fernville. And all of these orange homes are homes that have been bought back by FEMA and have been condemned because of the flooding that occurred during that storm. So that's, this is a bigger picture, but I'm trying to explain that it's so important to understand the context, the history, and how a site can be affected by these bigger picture things, and how you need to understand this then to start to understand and apply. In this case, they wanted to do some green infrastructure. So this whole project was all about water quality, and yet we had to look at the flooding issues. We can't just ignore that. We really needed to look at what is happening with the water that's flowing through here during major storm events, and then consider that in our approach to the green infrastructure. So one of the big things that we told this community was we will not be able to fix your flooding issues. There is always, because of this low point at this point, putting in your green infrastructure, your little stormwater BMPs, your rain gardens, daylighting your storm sewers and things like that are not going to improve those big storm events and the amount of flooding that goes through here. So that was kind of the big picture that came out of it. Then what we could do is we started to look at things like this big deposition area where they actually have the settling pond for their sewage treatment plant on this side. They actually dug out that whole deposition zone and pump and discard all their their sewage, treated sewage deposition area in there. So looking at actually a zone then, taking out some of the homes that have been removed and kind of blending back that floodplain wherever we could to do some water quality treatment of the discharge. But anyway, so that's just kind of the approach on more of a regional level, and then looking down at the lower level. The next step, and I think if there's any takeaways from what we're talking about, it's really understanding your soils. So typically we'll do soil samples, or at least have a base understanding of what the conditions are at the site. And so the starting point for most all of you, I'm sure, are aware of the soil series and the actual soil surveys for each of the counties, and it's a great resource just as a starting point for any project. There's so much information in these, down to what type of native plant communities the different soils in the area will support. So that's a good resource. The subsurface investigation, and then collecting the soil samples and sending them to, who do we use for the soil samples? Extension service.
Yeah, we typically send ours out to a group out of Illinois, I think Illinois, called Spectrum Analytic. Yeah. They have everything's online. You submit your soil samples, submit your orders for the type of testing you want done, and then you package it. Your shipping label prints, your labels for all your soil packets print. You send it to them. I would say for what you get, they're very inexpensive, and their turnaround, usually we have something in, I would say, 5 days from the day we send it, and it's online. You get an email and it says, get on the website, and your results are there, and you can print your reports from that.
What is it that we look for as a base when we get that information back?
It depends. Generally, we'll look at suitability for planting, for ornamental and turf grass, or we'll look at it from an agricultural standpoint. You get the same results back in terms of what they test for, but their recommendations change based on whether or not you're asking, if your pH comes back, they'll make a recommendation for how much lime to add. And the recommendations are based on whether or not you're asking for agricultural recommendations or turf and ornamental recommendations. In addition to that, we typically get texture analysis to understand sand, clay, loam, and the soil texture. because those are kind of the critical, for us at least, are the critical components of our design.
What was the name of the company again?
Spectrum Analytic.
And they're out there in Illinois?
Illinois, or, yeah, I think Illinois, somewhere Chicago area. I'm not.
Do you know why we've been, because I know we've used a couple different soil testing groups. Do you know why we're using Spectrum?
I have no clue.
Penn State Ag Extension?
Yeah, I mean, we use them.
Good enough, or? I'm just curious.
I have no clue. That kind of predates my time with land studies.
I would doubt the turnaround would be a lot different. You can't, 5 days, probably.
I mean, I send, if I
I'm
send.
not saying I bet that's the private, the difference between.
Oh, right, yeah. And a lot of times, there was a lot of the residential work I do, people, when they sign the contract, they want it done the next day. So, and you know, for me to go through the process and make sure I'm doing everything right, I take the soil samples on them and send them out on a Monday. A lot of times I'll have an email by Friday. So I would guess that's the primary
Yeah,
reason.
I would probably, because I remember we used to have to wait for it to come back by mail previously. And it would, you know, sometimes it would take a couple of weeks.
And the convenience is,
That's probably what it
being able to do everything online these days is like second, and they save everything. So I can go back to last year and look at soil reports that I submitted. And their user interface is nice. We have like 5 people in the office that will send soil samples in, and depending on who sends it in, you'll get the email for your projects and not everybody else's. So for us, bigger office has been nice.
Water resources. This is really just kind of starting again at the bigger picture and kind of working your way down. So understanding where the site is within the watershed. Is it headwaters? Is it down closer to the confluence? Is it getting a lot of influence from other areas? We'll typically do a drainage analysis for the site, very preliminary, just enough to get an idea, how big a drainage area is, what's coming through the site. Surface drainage assessment, it's, really important to understand how is the site, how is it draining right now. And a lot of times that takes going out to the site and actually looking at it and making those determinations. One of the things that we found is, USGS and GIS and stuff you can make assumptions with, but what you might think be where the drainage is coming from and what it's connected to may not be what it actually is until you get out there. There's been some sites we've worked on, especially in some of the boroughs, and when you start to understand this history and a lot of these things that we've been talking about, a lot of our boroughs and small towns and hamlets were built around these, these dams and these grist mills. So they were in kind of floodplain areas, and they have streams that run through them. Well, if you go back and you look historically how our floodplains used to be, they were these huge wetland systems. And so in reality, some of these towns have been built, they were filled in, and then what they did was they actually trenched through and created these to dry everything out so they could build their town. So there was one park that we were working on up in, it was North Lehigh Valley, Wind Gap, I think was the area. And it was kind of a headwaters area in the watershed. And there were all these, what we thought, and we were located on, maps and GIS, was that there were these like tributaries or unnamed, intermittent streams and things. And we got up and we started tracing these streams back. And you'd go back and there would be, there'd be water in it. And then all of a sudden it would disappear. There wasn't anything. And there'd be this huge kind of wetland area. Well, what we realized when we went back and started to look at all the old historic maps was that that entire area was a huge wetland. And there were all these trenches and all of these streams that basically created this grid system throughout the entire town that were flowing in all different directions. So it went against, what you would really look at as how the drainage would go in the watershed. But you really had to understand that, this entire site at some point or another was a wetland. And all of these, what are streams, are actually trenches to drain it. So surface water identification, that's basically identifying your water features, or you know, where you have standing water, where you have ponds, your streams, and things like that. Potential regulatory requirements, then looking at what are the regulatory agencies that have jurisdiction over what these different types of water features are. So, for instance, a drainage trench may, you know, be perceived as kind of an intermittent stream or something like that, but it doesn't have the regulatory significance as, say, a high quality or water intermittent stream, or a stream that's a tributary, something like that. So really looking at those regulatory compliance issues, and then that goes into the floodplain, floodplains, 100-year floodplains and floodways. They have two very different levels, I guess, of compliance needs. Floodways, really, you need to stay out of it as much as possible. The floodplain obviously has different levels of regulatory compliance associated with it, but understanding where both of those are. This is an example of FEMA, who I'm assuming most of you work with the Flood Insurance Management Agency mapping with that shows mostly the 100-year and 500-year floodplain events. And then riparian buffer locations, just did analysis of the riparian buffers, and that's really just vegetation. Is it, you know, is there canopy cover? What are the ground covers in those areas, and things like that, and the connectivity of the riparian buffers through, you know, related to the water resources. And then stormwater outfalls and structures, understanding any existing stormwater systems that are in place and how they're functioning, this type of thing. Are they collapsed? Are they actually working? A lot of times, you know, you can't see this. We'll go back and we'll do assessments, and you're basically tracing downspouts out, trying to find where those outfalls are, or tracing back outfalls to find out where the storm sewers, what's feeding into it. Sometimes you can't even find it. Sometimes municipalities have no clue. And you know, in some cases with utilities and things like that, we'll talk about this a little later. There's, to a degree, you can rely on one call. We have not had a lot of success with one call, and we've gotten to the point where we don't rely on it completely. It's necessary, but PA one call from a design standpoint to get an idea as to where utilities are. But typically, we've started to use an actual private company that does utility locating. Does anybody use any of these groups? We've been using master locators. I think there's some other groups out there that are private, and they go in and they will identify all the utilities on a site. It can be expensive, so we try to go through kind of a process of elimination, going through the one call first, get an idea, work with the municipality or the landowner to find out, you know, how much information they have on utilities, and then taking that and making some assumptions, and then helping to guide where we want the private locator to go in and find those utilities. They can also size them, give you an idea, a little bit better idea on how deep they are, the different utilities, and what kind of materials. So understanding those subsurface conditions are important. And then wildlife, understanding the context of the site in relationship to these wildlife corridors, you know, threatened and endangered species, PNDI analysis or searches are pretty standard, I think, anymore, especially if there's anything with a wetland delineation, but it's pretty simple too. Yeah, it's...
Any land works, you have to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, so that pretty much takes care of, you know, your threatened and endangered species, and then working down, looking at what we talked about earlier with those wildlife corridors, looking at the influence, and, you know, where the site is in relationship to those corridors. Nuisance wildlife, really important to get a handle on that up front, and a lot of times that takes either seeing, you know, evidence in the field, looking for that. Is there a lot of deer pressure? Or is it just, you know, they're kind of coming in and browsing a little bit? The resident geese, you know, on down to just all different types related to nuisance. And this is nuisance wildlife in relationship to how it's going to affect eventually what you're going to be planting on the site. So. And then threatened and endangered plant species, which is all tied with PNDI. And then understanding your physiographic region, where you are. Here we are in Blair County, so you're in the Appalachian Mountains section. That, I mean, from the standpoint of if you are working in this area, you have a good understanding of that, and what the needs are for the physiographic region. So basically then an assessment and kind of understanding what the plant communities are within the site and the context of them within the region. So there are the dry mesic uplands, the richer uplands, these different types of plant communities associated with that, the floodplains, you know, the periodic inundation, the plant communities associated with that consistent hydrology and the wetlands, and then the actual standing water condition of those plant communities. In, you know, a basic understanding of these in relationship to the physiographic regions. And again, going back to the soil survey, you know, it's a good resource from just a very generic standpoint, looking at those plant communities and the soils maintained is a good starting point too. Okay, so now just to kind of go back and look at, all right, so how do you pull all of this together? And I guess I'm a little old school, but you know, the whole existing conditions base map, putting it all on a base map is helpful. And going through the whole process, and I think it was Ian McCarg, I think that started looking at, you know, we need to layer all of this information together and then read that, and what does it tell us about the site. It's a critical process, and no matter to what degree of analysis, I mean, I've worked on projects that have analysis this thick, and maps and maps and maps, to, you know, just a smaller, simpler project. It's still an important process to at least go through so that you have that base that you're able to identify all of this information on that supports your eventual design. So, you know, this is just a listing of typical features that you can kind of go down through to make sure you've covered on your site analysis. Fortunately, we have GIS and all this great available information now, so it's not as hard to get this information as it used to be even just 10, 15 years ago. But you know, your legal boundaries, your survey information, you know, even without actual outbound surveys and you know, more of a legal survey information, there's so much you can get now just on GIS to relatively identify the boundaries of a particular site. So, which is so helpful in the upfront, especially for smaller projects. You know, buildings and structures, walls and fences, site access points. Really important to look at that initially, just making sure that, you know, identify where are the best areas to access the site, both from a site distance standpoint and, you know, you don't want to have you know, a lot of crossings and the permitting associated with that, or super steep slopes that you have to be, you know, blasting into rock to get up to it. It's, you know, it sounds like, you know, some pretty basic information that everyone should have for a site, but it's amazing the projects that you see out there. That, like, did anyone really think about this beyond just like a flat map and not really looking at what is available at the site from an access standpoint? Impervious surfaces, generally the topography, we typically like to try and get 1 foot contours if possible, especially on the smaller sites. Slope, understanding where the steep slopes are. The aspect of the slope, is it south facing, north facing? That has a lot to do with the microclimate of the area. And circulation and access, you know, where are your water features, what type of water features, you know, your different types of vegetation, and then your infrastructure and utilities, and really kind of understanding what your setbacks are and things like that. Okay. So I like to think of actually designing as this process that combines, you know, the art and the science to a degree, and it's become increasingly a complex process that we like to think still allows some creativity. In some cases it's a little harder to do, but I think it's still important, and I don't think that there should be really any project that you get involved with that there isn't some form of either, you know, potentially a sustainable element or some form of creativity that can be applied. I like to think that every project you should be able to do that with, and it shouldn't be just, well, because it's this, I shouldn't have to worry about any of that. It's a throwaway project. So, okay, so we pretty much went through that, and then looking at, you know, the needs of the client. So here, again, kind of old school, but I typically do go through a quick analysis on the site, and this is taking all of that natural resource information, and typically the next level is to analyze, and these are more the design elements. So this would be things like views, focal points. As landscape architects and as designers, we typically will look at this. We look at a site more from, you're kind of envisioning what it looks like and what it's going to look like, the entire process that you're designing. So you're going to be looking at important views, at focal points. Where are you driving, and what are you looking at as you're driving? If you're going down along here and there's a curve in the road, you aren't looking this way. You're looking straight ahead the entire time you're making that turn. So everything that's happening on the inside of the curve, you really aren't. No one's really seeing that. And again, it may sound like very, very simple. Well, you know, everybody's going to get that. But it's amazing when you at least put it down on a piece of paper and you show it on your plan. Sometimes that can start to drive what ends up happening in certain areas as to what you end up doing. So again, it's important stuff, because it'll tell you where do you need buffers. You know, if you have a whole area, if it's a used car lot or you know, the whole service dumpster area for this adjacent property, you know, you need some kind of buffer there. Just throw it in, scribble it, you know, so that you at least know as you're going through the process that that's an area you want to be on the other side. Drainage, doing some kind of an analysis of how the drainage is running through a site, where it's going, where your low points are. Vegetation, what types of vegetation, and depending on the project, this can get to be pretty detailed. We'll get down to things like you know, the different types, where, especially related to invasive plants. If you have a really infested section of vegetation, you're going to want to mark that, identify that. If you have an area that, you know, it's pretty pristine, this is really, really a nice area, I want to set it aside, I want to protect it, identify that, because that goes back to that protecting those areas. Then it's going to end up saving your client money in the end, and it also, you know, it's already established, so you don't have to go through that entire process. And then soil orientation, just, you know, never forget, I mean, that's important to really understand for right plants, right plant, right place, where the shaded areas are, you know, winds, where the winds are coming through, and things like that. Okay. So the conceptual design basically is the first step then, taking the program from the client and working down through, like I said, those first couple information gathering stages. If you're only dealing with one client, that's an easier process. If you're dealing with a homeowners association or a huge group, that can be a pretty intensive process. Parks, another one type of project where you go through almost a focus group kind of visioning session to try and gather as much information up front as you possibly can, and then taking that concept back to that same group, reiterating what it was that you had heard from them, and then how you responded to what they brought out in those meetings, and what came out of it as far as applying the actual program for the project. So, and then demonstrating how these native plants, you know, can be used to accomplish those goals, and then helping the client to visualize it and kind of go through that process. Andy started talking about this a little bit. I'm going to bring it into it from a little bit of a design, but you know, from a sustainable landscape standpoint, there's really, you know, there's two approaches, and they can be used in two different areas. In some cases, it's only one approach, whether it's a traditional landscape style using native plants, and that, when I say traditional landscape style, that's, you know, it's an area that's mulched, it's beds, that you're actually planting into, but using native plants as a replacement. So I see that as one particular style. It has its place, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not the same thing as what we're calling a naturalized landscape style. And that style is a whole different level of educating the client. It's a whole different level of patience, and it's just a different level of maintenance and kind of understanding of what they're going to be getting into. So I think it's really important to understand the difference between those two and where they get applied in the design. And then another component of these designs that we find is probably the most important area from a design standpoint is that transition treatment between the use areas and those naturalized areas, especially with those sustainable landscapes. And this goes back to what I was talking about yesterday with, you know, people's conventional aesthetic for landscape, and their understanding and need for control is in that line, is in that edge. And they respond very well to a nice clean edge. I often refer to it as like a golf course. I use that analogy a lot with clients. Okay, you have your green, you have your really highly maintained area, and then we will establish, you know, the rough. Well, people are okay at a golf course with that rough, but it's a nice clean edge, it's a nice clean line. And what happens beyond that, sometimes it might not look that great even for a period of time while it's getting established. But as long as you have that nice clean edge, people are more, respond better to it, I guess is the best way to put it. If it's a straight line, I typically, it's a harder one, it's a harder sell, unless you have done that for a particular reason, like it's a more formal garden, or you put a fence up or something like that, and then you have a straight line, and then it's meadow, or it's something more naturalized behind it. Because it almost seems, if you take it to the edge of, say, you know, a typical subdivision lot, they will mow right to the edge of that line where the surveyor, you know, line went, where their property line is. Well, it's like, well, they aren't maintaining back there, or they aren't taking care of their yard, or they aren't doing this. But if it's curved, you've created almost a design element. I mean, just through mowing, you kind of can start to create something out of what really could be nothing. So this is really an important component of how we look at our designs and making sure that that transition is addressed. The other thing with sustainable landscapes and bringing this all into play, and it ties into this transition, is making sure that you don't end up with, what's the best way to put it, these no-man lands. I call them, there's transition spaces in between. So let's say you have a bioretention area, you know, that's kind of this island, and then you have a meadow that you're putting in, and then you have another lawn area or something. Sometimes, you know, you'll start to design and you'll have these, but you haven't considered how they all connect and what the transition is from those. So it's really important, and sometimes that's almost the hardest piece, is how does all this stuff come together and how does it all connect? And is it going to look good when it's all done? And so I think that the more that you can integrate, you know, your bioretention into, say, maybe your meadow areas or something like that, that they can all be maintained a little more consistently, is typically easier than if you have a bioretention area and then you have a berm the whole way around it, and then you have a meadow on the other side. Well, you end up, sometimes they'll start mowing that berm in between, and you get these just kind of strange areas in between. So just don't not address it. The best thing is just come up with something so that you at least don't end up with these kind of strange intermediate areas. We were at a site, what was the one down in New Garden Township? There was a township building that went in, and they had this huge property. They had maybe, what, 15 acres, something like that. And they applied all of these great BMPs. They had rain gardens. They had these different. They had an amphitheater that they put in. They were phasing it, and that's another thing. You know, phasing. Don't just leave out the phasing, because you know people know that they'll walk up and they'll see, well, they aren't finished with this project yet because that site is completely just kind of left go. And again, sometimes it's just a straight line. Just at least curve it and start to blend it into the rest of the site. But what I was saying about this site was they had these bioretention areas, and then they were trying to mow in and around all of these bioretention areas. Well, they wasted probably a third of their site just in transition between where they had their meadows, where they had their bioretention, where they had their amphitheater. They had all these kind of strange open areas that were very inefficient. So if you know, you can look at tying all of it together, I think that's, you know, just really helps to pull the whole project together. Maintenance considerations is part of the design. It's not something that you wait until the end of the project and then say, how are we going to maintain this, and hand it over to somebody and here, you take care of it. You need to consider the maintenance staff, who's going to be maintaining it, the intensity of the maintenance that's going to be involved, because that is going to help you to decide what it is you're going to be doing. If they only have one guy on staff and you've got a park that is, you know, 50 acres and that guy just mows, you're going to need to really look at what kind of planting you're going to be putting in for that park. And it's going to be completely different from a park, say, down, you know, closer to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, where they have a whole, you know, maintenance staff. They're well trained. They have, you know, certified pesticide applicators on staff. Most municipalities don't. They don't have someone that is certified to apply pesticides. So they're going to have to hire a specialist to do that if they implement some of these. So it's all really important information to have up front, because you need to consider it as part of the design. And you know, this is just kind of one of those Understanding when you see these warm season grass meadows, this is where we see this coming into play often. First, you have that flush of right after it's been seeded. It takes time for it to come in. With those open areas, because it's clumpy, the invasives start to come into it, and it takes so much longer for those grasses and plants to get established because of their root systems. So sometimes it's a matter of using a graphic like this when you're trying to convey this to a client, that they understand ahead of time that this is going to take time. You're going to get what we showed you in that beautiful picture, but it's going to take 2 to 3 years before you get to that point. In the meantime, everybody needs to understand these plants are working hard and they're growing their root systems. So, you know, and this is what you're typically used to, is the sod root system here, which really doesn't take that long to get established. So concept plan, you know, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but it's really starting with a site that, looking at it from the standpoint of what is the context of that site, and then how do we work in from that context to you know, laying the actual building out and onto the site. And as opposed to starting with, here's my site, it's all lawn or it's trees here, and then plugging in all of your, you know, your BMPs or your riparian buffer, or trying to add all of this to the site in addition to what's required for the program. So, you know, this is just, I'll take you through quickly, but using the lawn areas as a design element. Seeing a way of applying just the lawn areas, and the areas here, it's just for not only that edge, but also for overflow parking. And then just the curve of that, having everything else meadow outside of that. In this case, this site from here to here, it was all agricultural cornfields in back. So it made for, you know, kind of an easy way of creating a meadow in the back. And then we plugged the infiltration basins and the bioretention areas in the low points of the site back into that meadow. So that way, this whole section can be maintained as one area, and all they need to do is worry about, you know, mowing the lawn in here, using the lawn then to establish here in front of the building, and then, you know, it's kind of a feature here to in front, but really minimizing lawn areas as much as possible is kind of a component of the sustainable design. Using meadows and slopes as an alternative to retaining walls. I've worked with, you know, a number of architects with that approach. A lot of times it's easy to just go in and say, you know, in some cases you have to have a wall. There's no way around it, and I completely understand that. In other cases, I see this just absolutely crazy stuff with retaining walls used basically to establish whether they can even build the project or not, because they need a retaining wall to get enough volume for their stormwater management. So looking at ways that you can establish some slope, get it stabilized, it reduces cost overall if you can reduce the use of retaining walls wherever possible. Existing low points for stormwater collection, it's pretty basic. Trees, shade on the southern facades, and integrating you know, those natural landscape elements. So can you take, you know, this area in front, instead of the foundation planting, but actually establish, you know, some small meadow area that's lower maintenance in front, and then maybe in front of that, more heavily planted, naturalized areas, something like that. But again, every little bit to kind of try and reduce maintenance, but also, why not use it as kind of a feature for the project. Landscape plan would be the next step then, is to go in and actually identify where the plants go and the areas for them. One of the things that we've been using more and more, and Andy and I were just working on a project right before we came up here with a landscape architect up in Connecticut who's doing they actually hired us to do to give them the plant selections for the project. And what I was trying to explain to them, they were really uncomfortable with these natural landscapes and they weren't too sure about how they were going to, be applying them. And tried to explain that we don't have to call out every plant that we're going to be putting into a certain area. The most important thing is to identify what's the effect, what's the treatment, and or the strategy that you're going to be using in that certain area. So, for instance, on this project, we ended up with kind of a floodplain zone that was like a ledge area, and we came up with a palette of plants, a selection of plants that they could use in that area. Any of those plants in any combination would work in that area. Don't make it more complicated than it is. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And have a palette of plants so that you can pick from. When the contractor gets that, they can then see what plants are available. They know what you're trying to achieve. And then they can work within that, give spacing, and you can come up with a quantity pretty easily for that area as long as you have the spacing and you know the variety of plants that are going in. Then we did the same for kind of a strategy for the transition, the slope areas, which was different from the upland areas, and we ended up with 2 upland areas, one that was canopied, that had tree cover, so that's going to be shaded, and another area that was open, and that was pretty much it. So we ended up with 6 strategies for this site that could be applied in all the different areas on the site, came up with a palette of plants for each of them, and then was able to actually come up with a quantity that they could actually price. So from a preliminary kind of planting plan standpoint, this is important for the structure and for certain areas when you're trying to define it, but then some of these other areas, sometimes just a strategy, maybe it's just how it's maintained, some of the things Andy was talking about with, maybe there's a no-mow zone that you identify where that's going to be, and then that's just a management strategy. And then there's some trees or plants that actually go into that, but the management, maintenance, the strategies, just identifying it then on the plan itself. So right plant, right place, I think we've beaten this one pretty good, but the organic matter and soil fertility, what kind of drainage and soil composition, that's all relative to those planting strategies that I was talking about. So say you have an area that's open canopy and it's wet, you may have a strategy for that area that's going to be different from your understory or canopied area that is really dry. And then you want to pick some of those plants, some of those we were showing you yesterday, the shady, that take the really dry conditions and things like that, that take with the understory. So precipitation, temperature effect, plant growth. Precipitation, I don't know if it's like as consistent as it used to be, but it seems to be running in more extremes the last couple years than it had previously, but it's still important to consider, especially for things like Andy was talking about with crepe myrtle, some of these plants that you're bringing up. If we're using plants for this area, that it shouldn't be an issue. Sun exposure, what I was just talking about, full sun, full shade, slope, how it's facing, consistency of the water source, and wildlife. Okay. Yeah, just some planting design, plant selection, some tips here. This is pretty standard stuff, but grouping plants in odd quantities. Using recommended spacing for each plant. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. There's different standards of spacing even among the regulatory agencies. But I think again that depends too on what the client's needs are. If you have a client that is willing to spend the money and wants more instant impact, you can take it to the next level. Sometimes we even do that with clients, is to look at those planting strategies and actually apply different costs to each strategy. So for instance, you may have a, maybe it's a basin retrofit or something like that. And one strategy would be to do the no-mow, which would be your lowest cost to get your ground cover established. And then to be able to go in and add your woody plants, but maybe you go with your 1 to 2 gallon containers. That's going to be your lowest cost. But what I always tell them is, you're going to end up with the same thing 5 or 6 years from now, but you've got to be patient in the meantime. You're going to be answering a lot more questions in the meantime. The next level might be adding, maybe you go in and you mulch the area and you put in plugs, and you add bigger shrubs. Maybe you go in with 5 gallon shrubs and maybe some bulb burlap trees or something like that. So you get more instant impact. It's mulch, so it's easier to maintain. It's going to be a neater, cleaner look, but that's a different cost level. And then you can go to the next level, which is spacing those plants maybe 1 foot on center, going with quart size, herbaceous, really packing it in so you get your ground covers established. That's a whole different level, and that additional cost is going to get them something that looks better initially. In the end, they're going to look pretty close to being the same. So that's the kind of thing and thought process you need to go through with the client too sometimes, is to understand the costs and the whole patience thing. Okay, layers. Layers are really important, kind of, especially with the ground covers and the herbaceous planting. So what is your ground cover? What's that base level? We've got some different sedges and grasses and rushes and some ground cover plants that stayed low. We'll typically go with a higher percentage of those in the rain gardens to get that base established, to get that cover. And then we'll go in with the seasonal interest into that to add your color, texture, and then also looking at the different seasons. So say you have ferns and you're going to want, the ferns don't come in until around this time they start to really fill in. So you're going to need something in that early spring to cover the ground, otherwise you don't have anything. So really understanding your spring ephemerals and maybe layering some later flowering and blooming perennials. And that's where I think that guide from North Creek is really nice for that, to start to look at that layering. But layering is very important from when you're putting these herbaceous plantings together. I've even seen, I think there's more, as opposed to creating drifts of species, so having your asters and then having your marsh marigold and doing things like that, starting to intermix them a little bit more, because what happens is your asters aren't going to come in until much later, and then you're going to have holes. And you end up with holes, and you've probably seen that in rain gardens and in different perennial plantings and things like that. It'll look great, but then there's this big area where there isn't anything during different seasons. So that's where the layering comes in, and the complexity of the design starts to ratchet up a little bit. How every plant contributes to the overall project, just overall. The blooming schedules, which is what I just talked about. And then, make sure that, you went through the time to get an idea on what plants, work with this particular area. Use that. Use that as a reference to guide the plant material, the selections. Keeping plants with similar watering requirements together, and just kind of understanding that in certain cases, there might be areas where you're going to need the water. In some cases, projects need that just to get started. So trying to keep those together. And how you use the plants and how they can buffer winds and suns and things like that. One other thing I wanted to point out was, I don't know if you're familiar with Doug Talami's work, Bringing Nature Home, or any of his research on, there is, what is it, page 96 and 97 of the booklet. This is, we went through his recommendations, and what it is looking at the various plant material. If you haven't read his book, it's really wonderful research on the plants and how they support wildlife. So what this is basically a listing of the different plant materials that are common to our area, and then the species that they support. So if you're kind of in a quandary as to what plants you want to use, and you have a client that's really interested in, supporting wildlife or certain types of wildlife and increasing biodiversity, you may want to consider using some of these, some of these plants that support a lot more wildlife. If you haven't read it or haven't seen, he's a great speaker. His book is Bringing Nature Home. We don't have it in here, but that's the name of his book, and it's really become pretty popular. He is also writing a book right now. I think one just came out with Rick Dark. Is that the one? Yeah. I forget the name of it. Yeah. Doug Talami and Rick Dark just collaborated on a book that came out a couple of months ago, and I haven't had a chance to get it yet, but I'm sure it's excellent, and I think it really supports a lot of what it is that he's doing. So this is exciting to have this kind of information to help inform our designs. Okay, so that's what this is all about. Yeah. All right.